Hi. Hi, everybody. I'm Kate West. I'm one of the producers of the documentary film When Lightning Strikes. And I'm here today with my partner, Katrina Michelle, the other producer on this film, and Lawrence Edwards, who we're really excited to have. When Lightning Strikes is a film about spiritual awakening and sort of what happens when you find yourself in a world you don't understand suddenly and how to integrate that process. And we were supposed to be filming this week, but because of coronavirus, we are not. So we decided we would connect with our audience and the people who need this information by taking our interviews online. So I'm here with Katrina. Katrina, do you want to introduce yourself and maybe Lawrence?
Yes, thanks, Kate. So my name is Katrina Michelle. I'm a psychotherapist, and Kate and I have come together around this project, inspired in part by her awakening story and my interest in the topic and my own story. And we've come together through this film to help people have an understanding of a process that I think we don't have a collective context for in our world yet. And there's a lot of information out there. A lot of it may be hard to relate to. A lot of it may just not make any sense to people. And we're really picking out people who can speak to this phenomena of awakening in a grounded way as a source of inspiration and with the understanding that it's a natural part of human development. So we have decided to take some of our interviews online in service of helping others to connect with this information as they navigate their own journeys, which we know can be quite tumultuous, as well as they are beautiful. So we're really excited to speak with Lawrence Edwards today. Lawrence is an amazing teacher and mentor. He is a psychologist, and he's also a gifted meditation teacher. And I will let Lawrence introduce himself a little bit more thoroughly. Thanks for being with us, Lawrence.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and giving me an opportunity to do really what I spend a lot of my life doing, is just trying to serve people in their process. And sometimes it's a process of dramatic awakening. Sometimes it's a gradual awakening. As you know, as a psychotherapist, awakening's happening on many different levels. But it's the ones that are particularly challenging for people to navigate that really draw our attention. I've had my feet in a few different worlds, from everything from training as a monk, training in Tibetan Buddhist practices, being on the faculty of a medical school for over 20 years, working in the science community. So a lot of what I've been able to do over the years is kind of develop a way to bridge different frameworks, different paradigms for understanding what these phenomena are, so that they don't mistakenly get, pathologized and dismissed. And that was something that I saw all the way back in my early training as a psychotherapist in the early 70s. I was working for a Jungian private psychiatric treatment center, and the director of it had trained with Carl Jung. And it had a remarkably open perspective, because Jung and Jung's psychology was able to embrace what's going on in these archetypal realms that are part of our human experience, without automatically pathologizing and dismissing them. And that it was really about, how do you get grounded, how do you integrate this, how do you support the aspect of the psyche that has that function in a positive way. And that's another thing that gets often confused on the spiritual path, because that aspect of the psyche is ego. And there are a lot of Eastern concepts about becoming egoless and getting free of ego that are often misunderstood what that actually means in real practice, and wind up being ungrounding for people. So getting a right understanding, and what are the practices that go into both supporting the development of a container that's related to the ego mind, as well as having the opening to the infinite, the expanse of being that is our real nature.
Thank you so much for that, Lawrence. I'm particularly excited to talk with you because on my journey, which was a radical, drastic Kundalini awakening that was anything from pleasant and I would call quite hellish, in fact, you were such a grounding voice for me, and provided me with information that I couldn't find anywhere else. It was the first time when I heard you that I really understood what was going on with me. And I had gone to all types of Western doctors, had MRIs, CAT scans, brain scans, everything, you name it, spent a ton of money, and then found out that what was happening was I was having a Kundalini awakening, and then found all kinds of crazy information online that just became even more traumatic for me. So when I found it was a video that I watched with you, I was like, oh my God, I finally have someone who understands what I'm going through and can help me. And so I'm excited to, help you connect with more people and give those people who are also struggling some answers that they may be looking for. I wonder if we want to start by maybe, because our film is about the spiritual awakening process, of which Kundalini awakening is one of them. I wonder if we want to start kind of by defining, like, what is Kundalini energy? And I know we've talked about how everything is Kundalini energy, everything is Shakti, but in particular, there's a specific arising that happens that people call Kundalini awakening. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, when we're talking about Kundalini and Kundalini awakening, Kundalini is a yogic term, and so it's a Sanskrit term. It literally means the coiled one, and archetypally, the image of Kundalini as a coil, it also invokes the notion like a spring, that there's potential energy ready to move. And that particular energy is seen as a facet of the universal energy that creates everything, creates this body, this mind. All that we experience is an unfolding in the Eastern traditions of what's Shakti, this universal power of consciousness. But it's also seen that, in order to experience what it is to be not all that is, not the true self, not our infinite being, not our divine essence, to go from the infinite to the finite, well, what creates that? That can only happen because of the power of the infinite to conceal its own nature to itself. If it's going to have the power of separation and limitation, it has to, in a sense, lose consciousness of I am all there is, that all I see is my own divine being reflected in everything as everything. To go from that, to go to a finite, I'm just this individual with just this mind and just this experience, it takes literally an act of the infinite to do that. In the Shaivite tradition that talks a lot about Kundalini, that's the power of the infinite to conceal. It's one of the 5 powers that are described in the Shaivite tradition. The power to create, the power to sustain, the power to dissolve or destroy, the power to conceal, the power to reveal. So when we think of Kundalini Shakti, that is that power to reveal. So once we have evolved across lifetimes our consciousness and get to a point in this lengthy evolutionary cycle of consciousness moving through and evolving through lifetimes, there comes a point in the soul's journey that it's time to reawaken to our unity consciousness and to be able to experience both the finite and the infinite as ourself, not just one or the other. The power that allows us to go beyond that concealed sense of universal being and embrace both our individuality and our universality, that power is what Kundalini Shakti is. That's the inherent potential energy of consciousness present in everybody. And it's not that everybody is in the same phase in their soul's journey, so not everybody's looking for that awakening or it's appropriate time or place or whatever. But when it is time, that's going to happen. Sometimes it looks spontaneous because we have no idea of what past lives we lived and developed and evolved through to bring us to that point of awakening. But the awakening has to do with then transforming our experience of who we are and what this world is that we live in, so that we get to see the unity behind the diversity.
Thank you for that, Lawrence. It's completely fascinating to me to learn all of this. And I think one of the things that I really love about what you said is it gives sort of a reverence to the process of what can be very chaotic in the sort of 3D reality, can be very chaotic and painful. Often it can be very beautiful too, but in my experience and a lot of people I know, it's been super confusing, but to actually think about it as something that your soul is ready for, that it's actually a beautiful process that's allowing you to experience more of what you are, that's a beautiful perspective to hold while you're going through something that can seemingly be turning your life upside down. It's actually not. It's turning your life right side up. You just can't really make sense of it yet.
Yeah, and when it's happening, spontaneously and without a container, that's where it feels like, oh, this energy is just going to, destroy the structures of mind or body or everyday life, and there's not an understanding of how is that transmutation happening, and also that in a sense the ancient yogic traditions. Well, they had a set of containers for that. I mean, the practices are containers. They were preparatory for it. They're helping people move through it. There were structures, spiritual communities, ashrams, where a person's, everyday functioning and that level of demand were somewhat diminished so that they would focus on practice and grounding and doing the kind of yogic work that helps to ground, integrate, and support a person moving through this.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's happening just spontaneously and we're in everyday life, we're surrounded by people in a culture that have little or no understanding of that and may pathologize it, then it just adds more and more to that confusion and to the individual's experience of what is going on. How could this possibly be described as grace? How could this be described as a gift? I'm suffering. I'm going through this, this process that just feels, never ending, or, where is it supposed to go? And all of that, unfortunately, is how the ego mind is trying to process. It's doing the best it can. And the ego mind, one of the things that's most scary for it when Kundalini is awakened is that, our ordinary mind, for most of all of our life, well, it was thinking, I'm in charge. I get to do that. I wake up, I got my to-do list or my not-to-do list, but I'm the one doing it, We don't have a sense that, oh, now there's some other energy running through. I didn't make that Kriya happen. I didn't, make that vision happen or disappear. What is going on here? So for the poor ego mind trying to get a hold of, wow, there's a larger consciousness than the ego consciousness. There's a larger energy of evolution rather than just me following, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do that. They might be self-help related, they might be yogic related. So even people who have been doing yoga, when they have this kind of spontaneous awakening, then they're going, whoa, no, I didn't know that was happening. I didn't know that was when they talked about, that, yoga and yoga processes, the esoteric goal of all forms of yoga is Kundalini awakening. But most people had no idea what that was, even accomplished yogis. I mean, the great master I studied with, Swami Muktananda, he had a classic experience of that. I mean, he was an accomplished yogi, was considered, a great yogi when he met his guru, Bhagavan Nityananda, and received Shaktipat, awakening, the influx of this energy that awakened. And he thought he was going mad. He thought his whole yoga discipline and everything had been destroyed by this energy. He ran away to find a hut in a mango grove, feeling like that he was just going to lose everything. So even having both a cultural context and a yogic paradigm for understanding it may not be enough to prepare the individual for the level of transformation that can happen through Kundalini. And that's part of what people then wind up confronting. And what often touches me is the vulnerable space that people get into. Because they are feeling like they're floundering and they don't know where to turn for help. And they're often turning to, Dr. Google or whatever they can find. And that's where some people are more traumatized by what they go through, encountering through, indiscriminate teachings or practices or even well-meaning people who just don't know what they're doing.
Yeah. Thank you, Lawrence. I think you're speaking to what I think is the crux of this problem, is that there are these beautiful processes at play, But if people don't have a place to go to help them understand what they're experiencing, they take it upon themselves, and they can really be confronted with a lot more challenges by people who, like you said, may be well-meaning, but a lot of people that I notice tend to dictate and prescribe for people rather than allow their own process to unfold and empower them to be with their journey in a way that's unique and authentic to them.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that I find is most important, is allowing people to make their own meaning and to be with their process as it is unfolding uniquely for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why Kundalini in the yogic paradigm has been so sought after. I mean, yogis would literally think of spending lifetimes of practice to have this awakening. So in that context, it's seen as really the most valuable thing that happens on a soul's journey from its inception. But the reason why that is because Kundalini unfolds a unique yogic process for that individual. You know, it's not like Hatha Yoga and you might go and, learn X number of different asanas, but those asanas were actually developed by seeing people going through kriyas. But the kriyas that developed those asanas were unique to that person for what they needed in that moment. So you might be doing a lot of asanas that are healthy and good. I wouldn't discourage anybody from doing that. But the yogis recognized what happens when this intelligent energy begins to stir and draws you into the unique kinds of postures, movements, internal shifts of consciousness, all of which are termed kriyas. But kriyas meaning movement of the energy, the intelligence that is going to go about transforming her creation. Remember, the body and the mind are Kundalini's creation. She knows everything about them. There's nothing mysterious there. And so when she's moving and doing things, it's to help clear up and move through, whether we think of them as blockages, karmic residues, some scars, different terms. But it's all about how to free up that energy, that consciousness, so we can come back and recognize the universality of our being. And the uniqueness of that for each individual is what's critical. We can see that there are general processes. There are general processes of transformation. There are general processes of purification, of clarification. There are karmas that fall away. They might be relationships. They might be jobs. They might be all kinds of things that the ego mind wasn't going, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for that. However, that's another thing we start to look at, because in this kind of paradigm, what was of paramount importance to the ego is not necessarily what's paramount importance to your soul, your greater consciousness. And Kundalini is that unfolding. So it can be at odds with the ego mind, and part of what has to happen along the process is that shift from the ego mind as being the one who thinks it's in charge and it has its list of things that it wants, spiritual, material, whatever they might be, and they get just brushed away. Because your soul, your greater spirit, your Shakti Kundalini might say, no, that's not really what you're needing. That's what the mind, the ego mind was thinking that you needed. So how does the ego mind now become a servant of your highest self and this energy and work in congruence with it, rather than being afraid of it, annoyed by it, irritated with it? Because one of the things we also see over, countless dynamics with people are two energies that really disrupt the flow of Kundalini in that process. Anger and fear are the two big ones. Anger and fear. So if we're doing things that keep us irritated, angered, annoyed, at odds, in contention with our own highest nature, with our own highest unfolding, that's going to create real disturbance. That's going to have to change. If we're afraid of everything, if the poor ego mind's going, oh no, what's going on, and gets caught up in fear, fear further distorts that, and distorts, and both fear and anger, we know this neurophysiologically, they distort our perception. Our very perception is distorted by these emotions. And so they distort not only our perception of the process, but they distort the energy flow of the process itself.
Fascinating. So, Lawrence, you've said so much, and there's so many questions I have for you. One of them that comes to mind is, how do we speak to this process secularly to people who don't necessarily believe in the soul? I know you've worked with medical school and you do a lot of talks about this process. I'm curious, how do we begin to bridge that gap for people who are of the material paradigm and yet may themselves be experiencing something like this?
Well, it's in part getting, okay, what is their paradigm? And so how do they understand? And so you want to start with where they are. Eventually, the Shakti is going to, awaken them to that there is more than their material existence. There is more than just their body and their mind. But yes, you want to look at, what are the ways that people can understand that. And people can understand, a change process. When you look at change processes in general, across any kind of change process, a change process has, one way of understanding is it has two phases: old pattern disruption, new pattern creation, right? Any change process. Well, you can think of that as learning. Learning is a change process. We have to disrupt either old learnings or disrupt what neural circuits are being used and establish new ones, to global changes that have to disrupt old patterns and create new patterns. So when a person's going through a process that's disrupting things, it can be helpful to just start to put it in a more normalized context. That, okay, these are aspects, and you can think of it, and you can draw on things like the way Jung would talk about it, that there are deeper levels of our consciousness that our ordinary mind is unconscious to. And people have, in general, a sense that, oh yeah, there's unconscious things, floating around in their mind that are also driving behaviors. Well, in a sense, Kundalini is one of the most deeply unconscious aspects of our psyche. It's that power of transformation. You don't have to jump to that, but you can start to talk about, well, there are unconscious processes and energies that start to move and ask us to make changes, just as they do developmentally. A child doesn't develop into an adult by a set of conscious choices. There's an unfolding of developmental processes on an unconscious level. Unfolding of the maturation of the body, unfolding of what's going on in the brain, and different kinds of neuronal circuits changing with age. There are all these underlying very concrete kinds of processes happening that can lead as a bridge to say, yeah, and this is a deeper level of that.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. Just looking at it as, that's how I understand this, is a new level of development for each individual, and something that a lot of the psychology textbooks don't necessarily get to. But that's where I see, this opportunity for the evolution of our understanding to come in. It's like, well, we understand human development up to a certain point, but then we shy away from, this spiritual domain, this transpersonal domain, whatever you want to call it. Really all it is expansion beyond what we already know.
Right. And you can start to see that this can vary somewhat from culture to culture. Our culture, Western culture, is particularly oriented towards the waking state mind. And with that, what dominates our waking state? Ego mind. So flourishing in that kind of cultural context has to do with ego development. What's the ego about? Prediction and control, power and possession. So those kind of dynamics become the hallmarks of, well, who's successful? The person who's hoarded the most wealth? Or the person who has the most love in their heart? Very different ways of evaluating what's wealthy, what's the richness of being human. So when we look at what's going on in that kind of cultural context that puts such an emphasis on the waking state mind, and with that the dominance of the ego mind, then awakening to these other dimensions of what we're capable of can be devalued, dismissed, pathologized. It's getting in the way of my waking state. There are people working on development of medications that would supposedly reduce the need for sleep because dreams and deep sleep aren't considered all that important. They get in the way of all your waking state activities. And so where does that head to? We've got to look at that. And the meditative paradigms, remembering that the understanding of Kundalini, or this energy of transformation, comes out of a meditative paradigm. It looks at the ordinary states of consciousness, the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state, as severely limited. And that the capacity for consciousness to go beyond the confines of those states is something that's inherent to who we are. Well, it's Kundalini, the Shakti, the power of consciousness that unfolds in that gives us access to what are the states beyond the mind. If you only went through the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state, and then you died, that's the sum of some people's lives. They never experienced what it is to move beyond that. What is it to transcend that? Well, who are you beyond that? You have a mind. Who's the one who has a mind but it's not the mind? Who's the one who has a body but it's not the body? Those questions don't even get brought up because they threaten the ego mind. So they're not considered of value. So when we look at life stages of development, they kind of end with ego development in late adolescence and early adulthood. And like, okay, now you're good. No, there's a lot more that continues to unfold. Even Jung noticed this, as people, he would talk about most of the people he was seeing were in their, late 40s, early 50s. They were in their sort of journey through life where those ego accomplishments had been done. And then they're going, now what? What's the meaning? What's the purpose of this life? What does this ego mind, with now its various skills, and maybe it's got, a list of letters after its name and it's amassed wealth, but what does it serve? What does it do? What's the meaning of that? These are the deeper questions that also begin to point towards, we have a consciousness beyond the ego consciousness. And when it begins to really unfold, to grab our attention and go, no, this is what you're capable of. That's another part of awakening.
Yeah. Yeah, the consciousness beyond the ego consciousness, and yet people will take this to their doctors and their therapists and be, like you said, pathologized, given a diagnosis, assumed to be, having something wrong with them because they don't have the understanding that there even is something beyond the ego mind.
Yeah.
So I wonder where you see us going in terms of trying to raise awareness. Do you think that these mainstream fields are ready for this? How do we create the bridges to serve people by educating the people that they might be seeing, the professionals out there?
Well, I mean, part of it is just that there are individuals like yourselves who can talk about this, and that people begin to see that, here's somebody who's has an integrative understanding, isn't dysfunctional, and that's a key part, because functionality is a measure of ego strength. That's and that's how it's viewed. So if a person becomes dysfunctional, when we look at mental health diagnoses, we're looking at descriptors of what are the aspects of that ego mind that may be dysfunctioning, and it shows up in emotions and relationships and self-worth, all kinds of different aspects of that. But to have individuals who are both integrated, you can see that their ego is functioning, and they can travel into these domains and come back and go, there's really something there. And so for that reason, I remember a few years back, I was invited to do a grand rounds for the psychiatric ward at a hospital up in the Berkshires. by a Harvard-trained psychiatrist who had an understanding of these things and asked me to come in and talk, because they had a couple of people in their unit who they were self-describing their process as Kundalini awakening, and the staff had at least enough wisdom to be able to say, oh, we don't want to just, invalidate that. Let's try to understand it. Hey, we hear there's this guy, Dr. Edwards. Maybe you can come and talk about it in a way that helps us to understand it, so that they can support integrative processes, because the dynamics from Western psychology of helping people to become more functional, that's not the issue. The issue is the denial that there's something transcendent, that there's something beyond that. And so if you can address it in a way that validates, yes, that's great, you're having this visionary experience, and how do you make your bed, get up to go to work, take care of all these different things, because those aren't necessary. So that the yogi who was doing intense yogic practices, in a sense, was building that container. It takes ego strength to get up at 4 a.m., do your pranayamas, do your different practices, go through the day doing yogic practices all day long. Those are all requiring a very strong ego, but it's an ego totally dedicated to serving the unfolding of that person's sadhana, their spiritual practice. So it's, again, what is the ego mind serving? And that's part of the shift that starts to happen with awakening, that it's not just serving material existence and, what would be symbolized in the yogic system as the lower three chakras, power, sex, and existence, subsistence. So there are higher orders of consciousness that now we can serve the heart and the boundless compassion. We can serve the mind and its capacity to embrace really expansive ways of experiencing reality. So all of those things can then become integrated.
I love what you said about the things that interfere with Kundalini are fear and anger as things that can inhibit the process, more complicated. And I think there are such natural responses to what's happening, because you don't at first have the sense of trust that this is actually leading me someplace that I like. You think it's totally tearing your life apart, and survival comes up so much. It's like, how, if I don't have my faculties to be able to work, how am I going to eat? If I can't get out of bed, how am I going to feed the dog? And people have families, and it's just such I feel like a natural part of the process is that fear, that real survival kind of fight or flight thing that we've worked on, you and I, so much. And I do want to say that in my own journey, just to give the people out there who are struggling with this, it really does happen naturally over time, like that unraveling of the ego. At first, I was like, I didn't even understand. People talk about ego, 10 times a day, but I didn't really understand what it was, that it's a series of ideas that I think make up me. And as they become unraveled, I've been able to trust more in the process that something else is animating my life and has far better idea of what's going to serve me and enable me not only to survive, but to thrive than I do. Even though I loved my life and I was a fabulous, conscious creator, and I had, it all kind of figured out, like, this is actually something that knows better than me. And it's actually becomes a relief then to rely on it. Like you can actually relax, you know what I mean? It's like, it's an interesting shift. And I wanted to also mention that progress, like, no matter how hopeless someone feels they are, it's going to happen. Like, the force is going to take you where you're going. Because I remember being in your office the first time I came to see you live. And prior to meeting you, I was in the car with my parents, kicking and screaming, hitting myself, like, just, things that you would take someone to a psych ward if you saw. And here I am on the other side, or still experiencing some of the challenges, but really on the other side of seeing where this is going and how it's serving my life. And in the beginning, I was nothing but just angry and afraid. So I just want people to know that if they're feeling that way, just hold on. I think sometimes it is a test of endurance.
Yeah. Well, again, it's, the ego mind has its agenda, and it's had it for lifetimes. That conditioned process of how the ordinary mind looks at things, we don't defuse from that just like that. And so that being able to step back and separate out consciousness from that while sustaining a conventional self. Again, it's not about destroying the ego. It's not about abandoning it or having it eradicated. It's that it doesn't become all-consuming, that our consciousness, if you think of the ego mind as a container, it's a pretty small container. It thinks it's very roomy and very big, but it's actually, compared to the infinite, rather small. And so when we're invited to know the infinite, it's not to destroy that little container. It's to say, oh, that little container, you know what? Yes, you hold a cup of beautiful water. Let's call that water consciousness. But you're actually floating in an ocean of consciousness. And you have the capacity to know both what it is to be the ocean as well as what it is to be that little bit in that container we call mind and body. So it's both.
What a beautiful analogy. That's just such a nice, simple way of seeing it, because it's so profound. It can be really challenging to understand. This is great. Is there anything in particular that you would like to say about this process of awakening or Kundalini, just your own thoughts about it?
Well, you've been to my retreats. I can talk on and on about this. And, I've been invited to write books by Sounds True and record the audio program for them and speak to people, meet with people. So it's, to me, and you're right, I do have a profound reverence for it, because this is my experience of the unfolding of grace and the unfolding of grace in people's lives. And as messy and challenging and difficult as it can be, it does resolve itself, because the energy of Shakti Kundalini is relentless. Once awakened, she's going to go. She's going to continue that process, even if it takes lifetimes. She's not going to abandon you until it's complete and you are free. And that's also part of why it was sought after, the awakening of Kundalini by the yogis, is because that's the shift. It's brings to mind what Kate was saying, that there's a relief. The ego mind, even when it takes on spiritual practice, it's willful. If I'm not making an effort, I'm sliding back. If I'm not doing my asanas, this thing is unraveling. If I'm not doing this other thing, it's not going to happen. That's the ego mind's perspective. Now there's an energy that's going to keep carrying that process forward. And now the ego mind has this momentum that it can join with, that it can participate and feel that sublime support from inside, so that the transformation that's happening isn't just based on, gee, I think I should do this, or I feel like I should do that. There's something much deeper, much more profound. Because the ego mind at this level can't do that work. It's like a potter working with clay. An expert potter supports the clay from the inside, even while pressing on the outside, and that's how it's changed. And so now there's that inner support of this awakened Shakti, and then also the forces of life and the things that are around us and shaping us. But now there's this extraordinary uplifting internal support that's present. And when we can really dial into that and experience it as that, that's where we get more and more free of the anxiety, the fear, free of the annoyance and the irritability and the anger, and begin to be able to feel like, oh, I really am carried in the divine embrace.
Yes. So well said.
Yeah, I had a interesting experience with that just a couple days ago, where my friends were going to a yoga class, and I got really, really mad. So I was like, I just want to go to a yoga class, but I felt so much crazy energy in my body. I just knew it wasn't the thing. Like, I needed to be still and just be with it and let it flow through. And I realized I don't need to go to yoga class. Yoga is doing me. Yeah. And I had a little paradigm shift in that moment, and I felt a lot better after.
Yeah, with Kundalini awakening, yoga class never ends. All right, with Kundalini.
Yeah, exactly. I can't get a break.
There are no time boundaries. She doesn't go to sleep. She doesn't give up. every moment, every day. So that means how do we join in every moment, every day? That becomes part of now what the seeker is doing. That's why practices like mantra that help contain the mind, calm the mind, keep it present, keep it centered, keep it out of fear-based samskaras or patterns or other ones that don't serve. So the practices now, moment by moment, they also are helping to keep us in harmony with and in concert with where Kundalini wants to take our consciousness into this extraordinary state of all-embracing awareness.
Perfect. I love that quote, Kundalini awakening, yoga class never ends.
True. I wonder what you would say, Lawrence, to the people who are struggling about getting support and what kinds of things they could do to support themselves. I know you support a lot of people
right
in your practice.
Well, there are, and it's also part why, it sounds true, and Tammy Simon asked me to produce the Awakening Kundalini 7.5-hour audio program and the companion book that has more information there to support people, because there are a lot of concrete things that a person can do. And some of them, even when we make, some people need to make use of mental health experts. They might need to see a psychiatrist. They may need to see a psychologist, and there might not be somebody in the area who's transpersonally oriented and really understands. So they have to know, how do they approach that? How do they be able to talk to even mental health professionals so that they're getting the help for some of the symptoms without necessarily shifting their own personal paradigm on why those symptoms are meaningful, even if they're disruptive. Because it's that's what bothers me about traditional Western psychology is it so diminishes what the meaning and purpose of these kinds of unfolding experiences are, in an attempt to help build the person's ego structures, help them become more functional again, but not at the sacrifice of yourself, not at the sacrifice of what's so profoundly meaningful. And numinous experiences, they can't just be dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. I have a question that comes up for me that I don't feel like anyone's addressed in all of the literature that I've read or the stuff I've listened to, and that is, we understand that when energy is flowing, what causes people to experience unpleasantries are when it bumps up against blocks, and so it's working to purify those impedance to the design and connecting back to the oneness of all that is. For someone like me, who's done 20 years of spiritual work, and really felt like I had purified a lot of stuff, there tends to be like a self-judgment, like, oh, I didn't do enough, or I must have not purified my consciousness. Like, I feel like there can be a little bit of like, oh, well, within the community, well, you must not have purified your consciousness enough. But it's, we don't know what we've lived through in lifetimes, and, psychology is very complicated. So I was just wondering if you could kind of talk about that a little bit.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah, it does. But it's another aspect of ego bullshit. Because it's the ego mind. That's the ego mind. That's not coming from a place of self, of wisdom. That's the ego mind doing compare and contrast. Well, they should have been done this. This was different. If I had been this, it would have been that. That's what it means to let go of that. That whole judging paradigm is a build from the ego. So, if you're in that, please get out. It's only going to create suffering. And yes, absolutely. I mean, the yogis, Buddhist yogis, Hindu yogis, all recognize that the patterns, the limiting patterns that have accrued over lifetimes, well, they take lifetimes to undo. There's no shame or blame in that. You don't become more divine. Kundalini isn't about becoming more divine. It's realizing the fullness of your divinity. The ego mind and all its self-help kinds of ways of orienting itself to, whether it's through yoga or anything else, thinks it's becoming more. If I do this, I'm going to become more pure. If I do this, I'm going to become better. No, Kundalini that's not it. It's about realizing your sublime, divine, boundless nature that has never disappeared, needs no help, doesn't need 12 steps, 6 steps, any number of steps. It's full, complete in itself, right here, right now. The only thing between you and that experience is the identification with the mind. So Kundalini is about defusing consciousness, again, from that little container and say, no, you're the infinite. The infinite doesn't need a self-development course. It's beyond being judged. It is the divine. It's all-encompassing. It knows that there's never a time, there's never a place that you're not in God's loving embrace. That is that consciousness. So anything else, those little things that pop up out of the ego mind, we just go, oh yeah, that's the ego mind. Don't have to identify with it, don't have to get caught in it, don't have to defend it, don't have to explain it. Done.
So different than what we're used to.
Yeah.
Totally different. And there can be such a sense when you're in it that you've been abandoned by the divine. Was my experience. You know, where has
but who's the who that has that sense?
Right.
Oh,
exactly.
That's the limited mind.
Exactly.
Right. And it's running all its patterns. Those are the patterns that are in the way. I'm just limited. I just need this. If I had that, I'd be all better. No. And those really are tenacious patterns. They really grip our consciousness. We really inhabit them with gusto.
I think there comes a point, I'll just say this quickly, where you realize that even in those moments of feeling utter despair, that it was all divine anyway. All an aspect of it.
And to go beyond that, what illuminates even that experience? Even when you're in the depths of pain, what is it that illuminates that pain? That luminous presence is consciousness. That luminous presence is your self, your true self. Let go of the content and become the luminous consciousness that is illuminating that content. The ego mind is part of the structure of being identified with content rather than the sky of awareness that illuminates its existence moment by moment. Shifting to that, even in the worst moment, what is illuminating? What's that awareness that allows me to perceive pain of any sort, suffering of any sort, that self-luminous one that holds it all in its embrace? That's worth exploring.
And you can do that and also have a life and take care of a family. And,
oh, yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Amazing. Lawrence, do you want to share where people can find you? I know you have a YouTube channel. I know you do some various offerings.
Sure. Well, it's pretty easy to find me. There's 2 websites in particular. One is thesoulsjourney.com, and that's more about my personal work and writings that I've done and events that I'm offering. And then, almost 20 years ago, I started a nonprofit organization called the Anamkara Meditation Foundation. Anamkara is an ancient Gaelic term, means friend of the soul. And it's through that I offer retreats, weekly programs. We have every week an open, now virtual online Sangha, satsang, meditation program every Thursday evening at 7:15, and anybody can join via Zoom. That has instruction and talk and chant and meditation. And so the Anamkara website is anamkarameditation.org. So between Anamkara and the Soul's Journey, I'm very accessible.
Wonderful.
And you do consultations for people who are struggling if they want.
Yes, and people contact me and do Zoom or phone sessions from literally all over the world. So any way I can serve, that's what I do.
Yeah, and I want to say, as someone who's worked with you, your guidance has been invaluable. I actually don't think I would be alive if I hadn't had it, honestly. So thank you.
I know you would be alive because Shakti is, so.
Damn it, that reframe again. Yeah. Cool.
Well, thank you so much. It's really such an honor to be sharing this conversation with you, and I know that it's a service to others to hear your insight and give people that message of hope to allow them to move through the challenging pieces.
Yeah. And I hope people get, I mean, both in the writings I've done, the book, The Soul's Journey, the book Through Sounds True, a lot of it is also aimed at seeing the bigger picture and the processes, because this is something I've experienced, people coming to me, they get lost in these little trying to find the details. You know, they're going to study the subtle body, and, you know, there's 84,000 nadis to the subtle body, and what's all this detail? And that has nothing to do with getting free. I never found somebody who became enlightened by knowing even the petals of the chakras. This is the mind confusing information with power, confusing information with wisdom. To know the one, it doesn't mean getting lost in the details like that. To move through this process, the ego mind floundering and trying to get power and control and trying to substitute minutia of information isn't going to do it. We have to understand these broad dynamics, that it's the dynamic of this, the loving care of Shakti wanting to set us free. That's what's unfolding.
Amazing.
Oh, beautifully said.
Yeah. Well, I think we could have 10 more conversations just like this, but we're at about an hour. Should we wrap it up? Is there anything else you want to say in conclusion?
The only thing that comes to mind, Lawrence, and I don't know whether or not you want to comment on this, but it just flashed to my mind. In your book, you talk about kind of lightning, and I'm wondering, being that our film is When Lightning Strikes, if you have anything that you just briefly want to share about how you understand that analogy or your own experience.
Well, lightning, I mean, it's such a potent archetype, and because what many people don't even understand, you know, the way lightning works, there's not just the charge up in the sky. For lightning to hit the ground, there has to be an equal and opposite charge in the ground. That's the soul's journey, building that charge, building that energy, looking and seeking until, now it's, in a sense, it becomes in direct communication from the infinite to the finite. And this bolt of energy to illuminate and to cut through. That's why it's such a potent symbol for that.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
You're such a wonderful teacher. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Sharing your time and your wisdom.
Yes. We really appreciate it. Excited to get this out to people and give them hope and, you know, resources and tools. So
Good. And some clarity.
Yes.
Clarity. Exactly. Cutting through the crap, as I say.
All right. Well, thanks to everyone for watching. I hope you got something out of this conversation with Lawrence Edwards. And if you want more information about our film, you can go to whenlightningstrikesfilm.com. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.